Hello everyone, welcome back. This is Avorion episode 57. I'm Enigmius, and today we're continuing with the Chariot build, Chariot being our carrier. We just started in the last episode. We kind of got this main central front section of the ship roughed in. I'm happy with the profile. I wanted it big and beefy and intimidating. I wanted it to look like there was a ton of mass behind it. We're building it out of Algonite, so that supports the idea of putting a ton of mass behind it. That's the material that we were in line to start using next. The last build we used Xanian, and now we've got Algonite armor pieces. I'm kind of curious to see just how horribly this thing is going to perform when it comes to maneuvering around. But the key here is I have an idea of how I want the ship to look. I don't expect to need a lot of blocks for this build compared to some of the other ones that I've done, but I also don't think that this one is going to be plain or bland in comparison to things that we've done in the past either. I think there's going to be lots of room to do interesting things without necessarily having to concern ourselves with what happens when the ship hits 100,000 blocks again. This front section here represents a bit of a conflict for me. You can see I'm filling it in so that it's basically flat. We put in some of the glow blocks to just accentuate that little bit of work that we did, the horizontal pieces on the front end. We filled in that front section, and now we're doing the side section. And there's a part of me that does that for the defensive benefits. The thicker it is, the harder it is to punch through it. But there's also the part of me that recognizes that when we're using integrity field generators, structural integrity field generators, that it's less important that we have these sort of bulkheads and these barriers partitioning the ship into different sections to protect it. It's one of those weird things that I feel like I'm very inconsistent about sticking to one design or another, either acknowledging that we don't need to goof around with it too much because of the integrity fields, or just going with the flow and assuming that at some point the integrity fields are going to fail, we're going to take a lot of damage, we're going to be in a bad spot, and then these partitions are going to be the last little bit of saving grace we might have on our side. So it could go either way. Realistically speaking, I don't think it matters. You can do it or not do it, whether you're building the bulkheads or not. It's not going to hurt anything. Even if you never find yourself in a situation where the bulkheads are contributing to the defense, the survival of the ship, it's still adding health overall to the ship. So there's that aspect to it. So we have this front end, and I wanted it's fairly tall and not especially wide. And I wanted to make it a little bit wider just so that it looks a little bit more well balanced and not quite so skinny, I guess you could say. So part of that, you can see there's a bit of a jump there. We filled in this side section of the front end so that we would be able to attach stuff to it. And then I started building something and I wasn't happy with it, so I pulled it all apart and I left the pieces that I was happy with, and those are the pieces that just suddenly materialized. There was a bit of an edit there because it didn't really seem like the kind of thing. It's just panels. There's with a bit of a step to the front end, nothing especially complicated. And now I'm just using slope blocks to create a curve. The curve starts at the top and it goes forward as it moves down. And it's, I mean, fairly easy to see the actual profile itself. And I like the juxtaposition, this particular kind of curve versus the one that's going on in the central section, which is basically the exact opposite. It starts at the top and kind of very quickly goes straight down. I've done this particular shape, the one that we're doing on the side, in the past. If you've been following some of the builds that I've done in other space voxel building games, this is not a new profile for you. You've seen it before. I use it because I like it, but I also try and add a little something to it each time I use it so that it's not just reusing the same old thing. I would feel like I was probably selling myself short by not coming up with something a little bit better, a little bit more interesting, and maybe just a little bit different. Even if you can't necessarily say that it's better, just something a little bit different I think is appropriate. Especially when you're talking about what ultimately is a fairly simple profile. It's nothing really complicated that we're doing here. So one thing that I did, you can see we put in these horizontal pieces just like we have on the front of the central section, and they're lined up with the ones that are on the front of the central section, so that when we have them all lit up with the glow blocks and you look at the ship from the front, it looks like they're all on the same line with just a sort of a gap in between where it doesn't continue all the way around the side before it sticks out here where we're just putting them in. So it's a little bit different, not a huge deal. And then I wanted to have a little bit of an overhang over the top of those glow blocks. So I just put those little wee tiny slope blocks over top. And that gives us a little bit of something. A little bit of something. Very descriptive on me, I know. But it's just something when you're looking around at the ship. If you're moving the ship around, you're looking at it from different angles, you can see that those glow blocks kind of get obscured by the little overhang that we just added for all the blocks above them. And that's kind of the idea, is it just adds something without being particularly obnoxious. And now I wanted to finish closing in the front of this profile. And in order to do that, I had to convert some of these blocks to hologram blocks. We'll put in the armor blocks. We won't have any problems with the game telling us that they're overlapping too much, and then we convert the hologram blocks back to the Algonite armor blocks. Bob's your uncle. Will be done. So the front section here that I'm placing, these slope blocks, they're not flush with the profile. So when it's done, if you look at it closely, you'll see that we've got the curve on the front, this wider section in the middle that we're placing now. It follows the same curve, but it's recessed ever so slightly, and you can see there's a little bit of a ridge around the outside edges. So that's another very subtle detail that we've added into the process. It didn't take much. It was fairly straightforward, but I like it, and it's going to be part of a host of little details, hopefully, that will add to the ship, the appearance of it, and the fact that you can look at it and see something new every time for a little while, as opposed to the straightforward things that are sometimes a little bit more tempting to do because they're more straightforward. So we've got that main profile done, and we're going to come back to it, but I had this idea for adding more detail to the front end, expanding on this idea of this profile that we just put in, and I decided that I wanted sort of like an elliptical element sticking out from the side of the central section in front of this sloped section that we just put in. So we're kind of building it out, and then we're building it around. One of the things that I do sometimes is I just start building without spending a lot of time thinking about what I'm doing. It almost always ends up biting me in the ass, but it also sometimes turns out to be pretty neat. It just requires a little bit more work to bring it around to something that I'm happy with. And in this case, this profile that I just did there was no guide, there was no sort of rhyme or reason specifically to what I was doing. And the end result is that when we start putting in these horizontal pieces, when we get to the top, and especially the top left section, that curve coming down, it just isn't going to work. And it takes a little bit of time to kind of rework it and figure out how we want to try and fix it so that we can call it done and we can move on. And in this case, if I had have actually gone for a proper, accurate elliptical profile to start with and then put the horizontal pieces in, it would have been very, very easy and straightforward. But the fact that I just decided to sort of freehand it, so to speak, set me back a little bit just in terms of the amount of time that would be involved to create such a relatively small sort of detail. Now, you can see I'm using that horizontal sort of slat approach again. And I'm at this point, when I'm doing it, I'm thinking we're kind of pushing the limits of how often we can use this particular sort of design on the front end of a ship before it just becomes repetitive. And in this case, I think it makes sense. It's a shape, you know, that when I think about the front of a ship, this is kind of one of the shapes that I might expect to see, whether it's because it's a ship that's intended at some point to be an atmosphere, or it just likes vents on the front, I guess. But I decided one way to keep it from looking too repetitive is to avoid putting the glow blocks in the panels, in the pieces in between, so that we don't have it drawing attention to itself necessarily. And then also, once I get the main profile sorted out, I can build sort of a cowl on the front end so that it distinguishes itself from the other parts with the horizontal slats, not only by the fact that it doesn't have lights in them, but also by the fact that it has a more defined sort of cowl around the front instead of what we've got now, where they look kind of like grills on a truck. And you can see we're just starting to build that in now. We were satisfied with the profile. We spent some time reworking it until we were happy with it, and now we're just using these slope blocks, outside corners, inside corners, working our way around until we end up with this sort of slightly curved front end. It just kind of dips a little bit and starts working its way back towards the main section of the hull. And then we're covering up some of all of that work that we just did, and we're covering up a lot of it now, just getting this cowl sort of in place and finished off. But I think it's worth it in the grand scheme of things, because it does distinguish this particular element from the other elements that might be a little bit similar. And now I just wanted to build off the back of this so that it intersects with the structure of this curved section on the front. This is not going to be the end-all be-all of details on the front of the ship. There's going to be more that we'll be adding as I get other ideas, and as we get closer to, you know, the finish point. We like to do some aesthetic passes just to kind of give things a little bit more detail. But for now, I think we're making pretty reasonable progress. And by reasonable, I mean it's clear that there's still plenty of work left to be done. But I think I'm headed in the right direction. I like the way that it's going, even though I wouldn't look at any particular part of the ship now and say, okay, that's the final version. That's what the way it's going to look when it's done. So one thing I wanted to do was finish fleshing out this profile that we just added, because we can't just leave it the way that it is. It would look really, really bizarre, and probably I would be very unhappy with it in short order. And there's any number of ways that you could kind of take and expand on a shape like this that's attached to the side of a ship. But I decided to do something a little bit larger and kind of more sweeping in the design. So we've got this bottom section coming in. It's going to be sort of like an S-curve. Comes under the bottom and starts to work its way up, and then about midway through it starts to kind of go the other direction. We're doing that on the bottom, and then in the top section here, just a very slow gradual curve kind of starts at the front, goes up ever so slightly as it goes back, and then about the midway section starts going the other way, so you get kind of a flat rainbow kind of effect. And between the two, at some point they'll intersect, and that will be the finished profile of this side section. So it's not necessarily a complex kind of shape. It's not at all difficult or time consuming to put into place. You can see this top section in particular is going in fairly quickly. I really like those gradual curves like that, as opposed to just a plain flat piece. Having that very gradual curve, to me, makes all the difference in the world in terms of the overall design. Doing this curve on the underside wound up being kind of tricky. I did 3 or 4 different versions of it before we wind up at the version that you're looking at now. You can see we just got rid of one of them, and then we'll get there. We'll get there very quickly. I decided not to make you watch the entire process of placing them and then removing them and placing them again, just because there's not that much to the process. We're placing a rectangular block, a regular block, and then a slope block, and then another one, and then a different sized slope block until we get where we want to go. And in this case, you can see this is the S sort of profile that I was talking about, where we go from the bottom, kind of gradually shifts up, and then around the middle it shifts back the other way so that it's less aggressive. And between the two, we pull them together, we get the intersection, and then that's sort of the finished profile for now. Now, one of the things that I realized, and I'm glad that I realized it before I continued, because I was thinking about what I would do to finish off this side of the profile. Close it all off, add a few details, whatever, and then I realized that what I wanted to do as part of the overall design of the ship is I wanted to take the same profile and I wanted to duplicate it at the back of the ship. Now, I don't necessarily want to use the same profile along the top and the bottom, but that curve on the leading edge, I want to match as closely as possible to what's going on the front end, a little bit larger on the back end of the ship. And the easiest way for me to do that, obviously, is to cut and paste and rescale the basic profile, which is a lot easier to do when it's exposed before I cover it with some other stuff. So that's basically going to be the approach that I'm going to take. Rather than finishing off the side of the front section of the ship here, we're going to push back so that we can kind of start getting a little bit of the back end in place, and I can nab this front profile before it gets buried, before we cover it up with all of the other things that we're going to be adding to the side. So that's what we'll be starting with the next episode. We're going to start pushing back towards the rear portion of the ship. We'll get that profile duplicated, rescaled, a little bit larger on the back end, and then we'll go from there and we'll see where we end up. So there's quite a bit left to do. I've got a pretty good idea in the back of my mind exactly how I want this thing to look. But as always, this early in the build, there's ample opportunity for me to change my mind. If you want to be notified about the next and future videos in this and other series, the easiest way to do that is to subscribe to my channel and or follow me on social media. Links for social media are always in the information section below the video. Feel free to leave your comments and feedback. Thanks for watching, guys, and take care.